BhagavatSanga program. As you all know, this is our Srimad Bhagavatam program where we have prayer theme and devotees read the verses, realize it, and share their realizations. And the current theme is Lord Kapila Dev describing the beautiful form of the Supreme Lord, Sri Krishna. And these are beautiful verses from Srimad Bhagavatam 3.28, point 21, third canto, 28 chapter, 21 verse to 33 verse. These are very beautiful prayers. Today we have a very wonderful devotee who will be presenting these verses. Prashanth Prabhu will be presenting these verses. Hare Krishna Prabhu, over to you.
Hare Krishna Mataji, Hare Krishna devotees. Mataji, can you see my screen?
Yes, Prabhu.
Okay. I'm not sure which screen it's sharing.
It's the main screen.
Okay.
You can see the slide, yeah.
You can see the slides, Mataji?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hare Krishna devotees, thank you all for joining. Like Mataji said, we're going through Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 28, verse 21 to 33. I'll be focusing on the first two verses and some background for the for what Lord Kapila Dev is saying. So we will start with invocation prayers. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swami Nityanamane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschati Deshtarane Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaura Bhaktivinoda. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, thank you, devotees, for this opportunity. Thank you, Veena Mataji Satsar Prabhuji, for this opportunity. Please forgive me if I make any mistakes or say anything incorrectly. With that, we will get started. So, wanted to provide a little bit of background on this chapter and this section. So this section is in Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is Sutta Goswami explaining to all the sages of Naimisharanya what is the process of devotional life. And one of the stories that he explains is the story of Lord Kapila Dev. So Lord Kapila Dev is, he's the father of Sankhya philosophy, but his focus is, the ultimate goal of bhakti. He's a descendant of Swayambhava Manu and the son of Devahuti. And when he appeared, he's the incarnation of the Supreme Lord. And when he appeared as the son of Devahuti, his mother Devahuti asks him to explain the process of self-realization. She says to him that she's in ignorance, and she surrenders to him and asks for his guidance because she knows that he's a exalted personality and incarnation of the Supreme Lord. So these few chapters, I think 25, 26, 27, Lord Kapila Dev is explaining various things in this chapter. He's explaining the process of self-realization, and the title of the chapter is Instructions on the Execution of Devotional Service. So this is the very, very key points of everything that Lord Kapila Dev is explaining. So he explains many things that I think we have learned throughout, but it's always good to remember them and remind ourselves. A lot of these things we've seen in Lord Krishna says all of these things as well in Bhagavad Gita. So the main thing, he starts the chapter by saying, the system of yoga is there to concentrate the mind, right? So that's the goal of all of this. The goal of yoga is to control the mind and control the senses. And by practicing the yoga system, we can become joyful and advance on the path of bhakti. But the first step is on the path of yoga is to concentrate the mind and train the mind and control our senses by making the mind our friend. Then Lord Kapila Dev says, on this path, one must first do their prescribed duties. So that's karma yoga, right? So that's the first platform that we have to get to is doing our duty to the best of our ability. And Lord Krishna also says this is we have to do our duty. It's not appropriate for us to do another's duty. It's better to do our duty imperfectly than to do another's duty perfectly. Lord Kapila Dev explains this here as well. He says one must do our prescribed duty and must not do another person's duty. Then the next thing he talks about is the Ishavasam principle, right? This is Ishavasam vidam sarvam yat chincha jagatyam jagat tena tyaktena punjita magadha kasyas vidtanam, which this is the Ishavasam, the first verse, and it translates to everything animate or inanimate that is within the universe is controlled and owned by the Lord. One should therefore accept only those things necessary for himself, which are set aside in his quota, and one should not accept other things, knowing well to whom they belong. And so the important thing is understanding, one, that everything belongs to the Supreme Lord and everything is controlled by the Supreme Lord, and everything that, material or spiritual is all owned by the Supreme Lord. And then the second piece of the verse in the Ishavasam principle, right, is we should only accept what is necessary for us and what is set aside for us. We shouldn't strive for more than that. We shouldn't be greedy. We shouldn't be lusting after things that aren't ours. And we should not accept things that are not ours, because we know that everything ultimately belongs to Krishna. So again, Lord Kapila Dev says that we should be satisfied with what the Lord has given us. The next one is, he says, is understanding that everything that we have is due to the grace of the Lord, right? He says, whatever little that we do have, or whatever lot that we have, is ultimately due to the Lord's mercy, and we have to be grateful to the Lord for giving us whatever that is. The next item he talks about is spiritual master. So the importance of the spiritual master and how one should worship the lotus feet of the spiritual master. So this is paramount for devotional service, right? We have to surrender to our spiritual master. We have to serve our spiritual master, and that's the only way we can get some chance of going back to Godhead. The next thing he says is this is extension of performing your duties. He said one should perform duties that are conducive to spiritual life, and he says, Kapila Dev also says that one should cease performing conventional religious practices. And Lord Krishna says this in Bhagavad Gita as well, right? He says, don't be enamored by the flowery words of the Vedas. Those are for people that are looking for sense gratification and looking for material sense pleasure. So we should, Kapila Dev also says this, where he says one should cease performing conventional religious practices. He also says we should eat frugally and remain secluded. And we hear this in many other verses as well, right? You should not overeat or eat, not eat enough that we can't maintain our body. Lord Krishna says this as well. And then same thing in terms of remaining secluded, we should limit ourselves to what we need to in order to pursue spiritual life and spiritual practice. The last one of the last things he says before he goes into the next section is this is following the 4 regulative principles, right? So nonviolence, truthfulness, cleanliness, and avoiding thieving, gambling, right? These are our 4 regulative principles that Prabhupada has prescribed. Ahimsa, Satyam, Socham, and I'm forgetting the last one, but it's, no meat eating, no intoxication, no gambling, no illicit sex. So Lord Kapila Dev says we should follow these things. So these are all the base things that one should be performing before we even think about the devotional service and thinking of the Lord. So these are the basics that we should be doing. So then the next section. So in right after this, Lord Kapila Dev has several verses where he explains Ashtanga Yoga and how one should, we should fix our breath, control our body, control our thoughts, control our mind, and I think we have learned in chapter 5 in Bhagavad Gita. Lord Krishna explains the same things. He talks about how one can follow the path of Ashtanga Yoga. And then at the end of the chapter, Lord Krishna says that, all of that is good, but it's much faster to just do devotional service, which is to perform devotional service to the Lord. And everything that you could accomplish in Ashtanga Yoga, you can do by always engaging all of your mind and senses in the Lord's service. So same thing here. So the Lord has several verses, or Kapila Dev explains the process of Ashtanga Yoga to his mother in detail, and how one should perform asanas, one should perform pranayama, and do these things to fix their breath, fix their body. And after that, he gets to devotional service. So he starts by saying that one should always sing the glories of the Lord, meditate on the Lord and his devotees. So that's the first thing. So once we have all of these basic regulative principles, we are, in the mode of goodness, then we should be singing the glories of the Lord and meditating on the Lord and his devotees. And then he says one should meditate on the external form of the Lord until the mind becomes fixed. And there's 2 verses before verse 21 that are very important. So verse 19, Kapila Dev says, thus always merged in devotional service, which is singing and meditating the glories of the Lord, the yogi visualizes the Lord standing, moving, lying down, or sitting within him. For the pastimes of the Supreme Lord are always beautiful and attractive. And in verse 20, in fixing his mind on the eternal form of the Lord, the yogi should not take a collective view of all his limbs, but should fix the mind on each individual limb of the Lord. So Lord Kapila Dev is giving us the formula to meditate on the Supreme Lord's form. So he says, we can visualize the Lord standing, moving, lying down, but what we should not look at the collective view of his entire of the Lord's body, but we should focus our mind on each individual limb. And the first limb that he starts with is the lotus feet of the Lord. And the verses go progressively from the lotus feet of the Lord all the way to the top of the Lord's head. So we'll start with just the importance of the lotus feet of the Lord, and how and the main point that we'll arrive at, right, is that without the lotus feet of the Lord, we have to start there. Without the lotus feet of the Lord, we can't go to any of the other limbs of the Lord. So his his legs, his thighs, his chest, his forearms, and his face, and so on. So we'll start with 3:28-21. So I will read the verse and then translation, and then we will go through quickly the explanations. Sanchintayet bhagavatas charanarabindam vrajan kushadvaja saruruha lachanadyam uttunga raktavilasannaka chakravala jyotsanabir ahata mahadridayan dakaram Dridayantakaram. The devotee should first concentrate his mind on the Lord's lotus feet, which are adorned with the marks of a thunderbolt, a goad, a banner, and a lotus. The splendor of their beautiful ruby nails resembles the orb of the moon and dispels the thick gloom of one's heart. So this verse talks about the Lord's feet and lotus feet. And many times we've heard in pastimes, even in like the pastime of Kalia, where the devotees of Vrindavan, they follow the Lord's feet because they see all of these symbols, and everywhere the Lord steps, they can see these symbols. So these are the symbols that are on the Lord's feet. So the thunderbolt, the goad is like a stick that you a long stick with a pointed end, which you can use to like guide bulls, cows, elephants, a banner, and then a lotus. So the thunderbolt represents the smashing of our karmic reactions. So if we meditate on the Lord's lotus feet, one of the effects is that the Lord burns all of our karma, good and bad. The next one is the goad. The goad is if we like I said, right, it's to help guide animals, and Prabhupada in the purport explains that it's to control the elephants of our mind. So our minds are like stampeding elephants, and the goad, if we meditate on the Lord's feet, we can control these elephants. The banner is the Lord's feet protects us from fear. So if we meditate on the Lord's feet and we surrender unto the Lord, then we have no reason to fear. The Lord takes care of everything for us. The ruby nails are like resembles the orbs of the moon, and there are multiple explanations for this. And I think that the main one was the Lord's lotus feet provides all desired objectives of the devotees. So like the moon, right? The moon provides moonlight, and similarly, like focusing on the ruby nails and meditating on the Lord will help us get to a point where the Lord, all of our objectives and desires are satisfied by the Lord. Srila Prabhupada in the purport, he says, the main reason that Lord Kapila Dev is giving us this detailed explanation of each limb of the Lord is because we shouldn't imagine the Lord. And he says, Mayavadi philosophers, and or just, if we're speculating about the Lord, we may come to some view of what the Lord looks like. But here, the Lord's entire form is very clearly described. So these are the verses that we can read and we can meditate on to have that image of the Supreme Lord in our head. And so Prabhupada says the Lord's prescription is concretely given and clearly given. So don't imagine the Lord. Read these verses and understand what the Lord looks like. And the main piece of the verse, right, is focusing on the sole of the Lord's feet and the nail and his nails, which are ruby like nails that are like the orbs of the moon. They dispel the thick gloom of one's heart, which is the same as, we can be freed from the ignorance of Maya. So that's so, and that's the main objective, right, for on the path of bhakti yoga, right, is to get rid of our ignorance and our attachment to material nature, our attachment to our body, our attachment to our desires. And the first place we have to start is by meditating on the Lord's feet, and by doing so we can be freed from ignorance. And then the next verse is 22. So I would read the verse. Yet chau cha nishtrasarit pravarodakena tirtena murtinya kirtena siva sivo buhut dhyatur mana samela salila nishrishta Rajam Dhyaya Chiram Bhagavatas Charanaravindam. The blessed Lord Shiva becomes all the more blessed by bearing on his head the holy waters of the Ganges, which has its source in the water that washed the Lord's lotus feet. The Lord's feet act like thunderbolts hurled to shatter the mountain of sin stored in the mind of the meditating devotee. One should therefore meditate on the lotus feet of the Lord for a long time. So this verse, so the last verse talked about the appearance of the Lord's lotus feet. This verse talks about the importance and the position of the Lord's lotus feet, right? So this verse clearly says that Lord Shiva himself, who's exalted devotee, he is blessed by the water of the Ganges, which is the water that washed the Lord's lotus feet. So Lord Shiva in his devotional service understands that decorating our head with the water of Lord Krishna and the water that washed the Lord's lotus feet is crucial, right? So what that means for us is, right, if Lord Shiva is bearing the Ganges, the water of the Ganges, and the water that washed the lotus feet of the Lord on his head, then we should also do the same thing. So Prabhupada explains in the purport that if we strive to decorate our head with the lotus feet of devotees, the lotus feet of our spiritual master, and the lotus feet of the Lord, then that's the only way we can shatter the mountain of sin, right? And the mountain of sin is our material conditioning that we've developed over thousands and hundreds and thousands and millions of lifetimes. So it's all the dirt that we've accumulated, and only meditating on the Lord's lotus feet can break this mountain. And it's not a one-time thing, right? It's what Prabhupada explains, that you need to meditate for a very, very long time for this mountain of sin to be shattered. So those are the main points for this second verse, is the importance of the Lord's lotus feet, and how even Lord Shiva, Lord Brahma, they all worship the Lord's lotus feet, and we should do the same thing. So what do we have to do, right? What is Lord Kapila saying to us? And Prabhupada makes it pretty clear for us in the purport. It says the devotees are so fixed on the lotus feet of the Lord that they do not think of anything else. Those who practice the yoga system must meditate on the lotus feet of the Lord for a long time, after following the regulative principles and thereby controlling the senses. So, in this life, we have this chance to pursue Krishna consciousness, and Prabhupada says that we have to do this for a very, very long time, follow the regulative principles, chant, and that's the only way we can achieve liberation. And this is last few points in terms of what we need to do. And Satyasar Prabhu mentioned these to me. So the first one is Manana Kayate Mantra. And the best way to focus on the Lord's feet is to always keep chanting. And I think a lot of our parents and ancestors, they would always chant some mantra throughout the day, whether morning Vishnu Sahasranamam, something like that. So that's the best way we can follow this. And we have our mantra meditation every day at 5 a.m. where we have our japa conference. So that's the best way to start. And why do we have to do this? The mind is fickle and restless, right? And when you mentioned we have like 60 to 90K thoughts every day. So the mind is this elephant that's continuing to stampede. And, if we reflect, we'll realize that most of these thoughts are not Krishna, or centered on Krishna. So depending on how we use our mind and how we guide our mind, it can be our greatest friend or our greatest enemy. Krishna says that in Bhagavad Gita. So if we waste time and we waste thought, then we will build up that feedback loop and we will build up tolerance for wasting time. I think like if we watch negative TV, if we watch negative things, then we will become negative things. If we, whatever it might be, it doesn't have to be negative TV, news, whatever it might be, our consciousness will become full of that. So in that case, we'll be alive, but we're not truly alive, right? We're not pursuing Krishna consciousness. But if we focus on Krishna, we will never waste time. Krishna is transcendental, and any time that we serve Krishna is it's spiritual piety that never goes away. And Lord Kapila Dev has told us that the first thing we need to do is just surrender on to the lotus feet, and then meditate on the lotus feet with the thunderbolt, the goad, the lotus, and the banner. So what's our solution, right? It's, we have to do deliberate, sincere, reflective, metric-driven sadhana. And what I mean by that is like deliberate, right, is every time that we chant, we have to make sure we are hearing we chant. If we are not hearing the chant, then we have to be sincere about it and try again. And then we get lost and we reflect that we got lost, we have to bring ourselves back. And in terms of metric driven, right, I think, at the end of the round, we will know if we've chanted well or not. We will usually be able to know if we remember the round or not, or if you just went to the next round and you're just continuing to chant. So metric driven, meaning like, what's the feedback loop for the chanting? What's the feedback loop throughout our days? Is it positive chanting, or are we just doing chanting for the sake of chanting? So that's, I think, metric driven, at least some internal feeling or intuition driven. So with that, devotees, we're a minute over. So thank you for the opportunity. And then we'll end by just saying Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Thank you, Mataji, devotees, for this opportunity. Thank you for listening to me, and please forgive me if I made any mistakes.
Hare Krishna, Prashanth Prabhu. That was a very nice class, very wonderful. So beautifully explained. You started with what's the background of these verses and what Kapila Dev explains in this chapter. You very nicely summarized like the points you covered about Karma Yoga, regulative principles, Ishavasya principle also you brought in, nicely explained. And then the two verses you picked, focusing on the Lord's lotus feet, how auspicious it is and how it will eradicate sins and the mind. So much dirt is in the mind, and all those symbols in the Lord's lotus feet. You gave importance of those. And I really like the point you said, Prabhupada has mentioned, don't imagine the Lord's form. Lord's form is clearly given. It's not for mental speculation, right? It's beautifully described here. And to achieve liberation, we have to meditate on Lord's lotus feet. And the way to get there is through chanting. You brought in that as a solution. So beautifully covered, Prabhu. Thank you very much for this wonderful class. With that, devotees, thank you all very much for joining the BhagavatSanga program today. Next week is Diwali and Govardhan Puja, Monday and Tuesday. Please do come to the temple and get the blessings of the Supreme Lord. Next Wednesday, we will not have BhagavatSanga. We will have the BhagavatSanga following week. With that, thank you all for joining today. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prashanth Prabhu. It was a fantastic presentation, Prabhu. I really liked how you get the chapter summary, then very precise presentation of the first two verses. Thank you so much, Prabhu.
Thank you.